Let's take a look at Wall Street's week. It was a mixed one, with the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq Composite posting solid weekly gains. But the Dow just couldn't get there, despite Apple doing impressive work to help out that index. The stock rose more than 14% in the past 5 trading sessions. Now, that being said, today is also the last day of the month, and all 3 major indices closed out July in the green, with the Nasdaq seeing the biggest gains on the back of the seemingly unstoppable tech trade. Despite the solid week, there are still major threats to this stock market rally. The most obvious one is the currently unsuccessful stimulus showdown in Washington. Today marks the expiration of eviction protections from the $2 trillion CARES Act passed back in March, along with the extra $600 a week in unemployment benefits, although the last of those checks were already sent out last weekend. This $600 a week is one of the main points of contention in the Capitol. The Democrats want to keep it, and the Republicans want to reduce it. Despite meetings between lawmakers and the White House over the last few days, there is still no deal. This leaves tens of millions of Americans who are out of work without any extra benefit from the federal government, at least for now. But here's the thing. Even if Congress can make a deal soon, people will likely still have to wait days or even weeks to get that federal benefit paid out. Why? Well, the feds left it up to the states to actually administer the payments, and they're already strained under the weight of historically high unemployment claims. CNBC's Rahel Solomon explains why states aren't set up for a new program with different parameters on such short notice.
As Washington debates how to replace the expiring $600 unemployment supplement, one proposal favored by Republicans is a flat $200 bonus for 8 weeks, followed by a 70% wage replacement. Well, that was rejected this week, meaning that tens of millions of Americans now face the reality of much lower unemployment payments, at least in the near term until Congress reaches a deal. And while lawmakers debate, state labor officials who are responsible for qualifying applicants and paying out benefits, well, they are growing increasingly anxious and concerned about what a new program will mean for them. Several have told us that any new flat amount will need at least a week to implement, but percentage-based proposals like the one that some Republicans favored, well, that could take some states up to 20 weeks to get up and running. While Labor Secretary Eugene Scalia said Tuesday on CNBC he's confident that states will be able to make this work, not everyone is so sure. Officials in Georgia telling us that a percentage-based wage replacement is a, quote, big ask of state labor offices. Others have said that they're concerned that whatever is decided in Washington will be thrown upon them to figure out. Now, when the CARES Act was passed, labor offices really struggled to meet the demand, partly because many systems were built with outdated technology, and partly because offices were not staffed or designed to handle the type of volume that COVID closures caused in unemployment. And while we are now 4 months from when we saw unemployment first spike, some state labor officials tell us they're still under pressure to try to keep up with demand. And this as another 1.4 million Americans filed for unemployment insurance on Thursday.
And now let's get to our sound check. Here's a roundup of the week in business and just a few sound bites.
The current economic downturn is the most severe in our lifetimes. It will take a while to get back to the levels of economic activity and employment that prevailed at the beginning of the year.
So as the majority leader, I can tell you no bill will pass the Senate that doesn't have the liability protection in it.
To have a great vaccine that's gotten out to a high percentage of the population, so we have what's called herd immunity. Typically, that means 70-80% of people have taken that vaccine. And so even in the U.S., that's not likely until probably mid-2021 if things go well with the vaccine work.
Despite the uncertainty, we have a very strong roadmap. Our customers want, to partner more deeply, and we see revenue, growing now 32% year over year.
I can't answer that question yes or no. What I can tell you is we have a policy against using seller-specific data to aid our private label business. but I can't guarantee you that that policy has never been violated.
We're looking at TikTok. We may be banning TikTok. We may be doing some other things. There are a couple of options, but a lot of things are happening.
It's been a banner year for podcast acquisitions. Yes, there's the watershed Spotify deal with Joe Rogan, worth a reported $100 million. But it really feels like there's a mad dash to get into audio. Just last week, the New York Times bought Serial Productions, the company behind the wildly popular Serial podcast, for $25 million. And there have been reports that tech giants Amazon and Apple are looking to up their own podcast spend. But here's the thing. Listener numbers have actually declined during the pandemic, according to podcast technology company Voxnest. So why all the investments this year? The team here at After Hours set out to explain.
Big money is flowing into podcasts this year.
We've always known that consumers love audio. We knew that they loved radio. And so the question has always been, how do we take something that consumers love, audio, and adopt it for the digital age so that it becomes more useful? And podcasts, as well as streaming music, have been the easy answer for that.
Spotify in particular is becoming a major player. The company was already off to a great 2020, even during a pandemic, seeing a 51% increase in global podcast listeners since the start of the year. And here's where the big money comes in. Spotify has been capitalizing on this growth through some major acquisitions. It purchased sports and pop culture outlet The Ringer in February, paying upwards of $196 million for it. Podcasting pioneer Joe Rogan inked an exclusive deal with Spotify. Rogan said in 2019 his show saw 190 million monthly downloads. The Spotify deal was worth more than $100 million, according to the Wall Street Journal. Kim Kardashian West will create a podcast on wrongful criminal convictions for Spotify, and DC Comics plans to produce scripted series based on its superheroes. Now, it's normal for companies to invest in future revenue streams, or spend money to make money, as they say. But here's the thing. Even though more than 100 million Americans listen to podcasts monthly, the pot of advertising dollars is still relatively small, less than $1 billion a year. Companies like Spotify want to build out their own monetization platforms to attract a bigger pot of advertising money.
Advertisers like to message where consumers are. But the weird thing about podcasts as a medium is that the consumers are there. But the problem is that we don't have a good advertising or monetization structure for podcasts yet. And so the reason you're seeing some of these big tech platforms invest in that is because they think if I can build it, the money will come.
But it's not just Spotify making big moves. Earlier this month, SiriusXM agreed to buy podcasting company Stitcher in a deal worth $325 million.
From my perspective, there's really only two companies that are aggressively trying to build a serious podcast end-to-end monetization platform. And that's SiriusXM, which is owned by Liberty, and Spotify.
And in a deal announced last week, the New York Times spent $25 million to snap up the production company behind the massively popular Serial podcasts as well. Even though total advertising revenue in the industry is relatively small, podcasters are seeing it grow this year. According to Voxnest, ads within podcasts have grown 65% in the first 5 months of 2020. 44% of so-called super listeners said they paid attention to ads in podcasts, and 37% of them said podcasts were the best way for advertisers to reach them.
Oftentimes, hosts are reading the podcast ads, and so consumers are more likely to trust that advertising. But two is that they're great for what's called direct response, meaning I'm not trying to convince you of something, I want to get you to buy something. Oftentimes, if a host recommends a product and they give you a promotional code, studies have shown that can be pretty effective in getting you to buy a pair of socks or go get that t-shirt that you've been eyeing online.
Okay, time for the numbers round. We'll kick it off with 4. What a week for big tech. And the best number to sum up all the tech news is 4. The CEOs of 4 of the biggest and most powerful technology companies testified before Congress, albeit virtually, on Wednesday. Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Sundar Pichai, and Tim Cook defended their companies during an hours-long antitrust hearing. Just 24 hours later, and the same Big 4 all reported quarterly earnings within 30 minutes of each other. And there are more 4s in this story. Amazon spent $4 billion on COVID-related costs last quarter, an expense they warned investors about ahead of time. And then Apple announced a 4-to-1 stock split, essentially turning every share into 4 shares, each worth a quarter of the original share. Next is 5. The economy suffered an economic collapse so big in the second quarter that it wiped out nearly 5 years of growth. GDP, which is the broadest measure of economic activity, plunged 32.9% on an annualized basis last quarter. It would have likely declined even further without the trillions of dollars that both Congress and the Federal Reserve have been pumping into the system. And finally, 150,000. The country has passed yet another tragic milestone. As of this week, more than 150,000 people have died from the coronavirus in the U.S. America now leads the world in both the number of cases and fatalities. But in a hopeful sign, the Department of Health and Human Services said Thursday that it's seeing, quote, signs of progress in the outbreak in the southern states. That's it for After Hours. But before we go, here's one big thing to watch next week. Presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden said he will announce his pick for vice president, who he has already pledged will be a woman, by the end of next week. Now, some advisors close to Biden have cast doubt on the timeline of the decision. Either way, we'll be on the lookout for that next week as we get closer to the upcoming historic virtual conventions.